The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays over a sleepy little town. The kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and life moved at its own unhurried pace. On this particular summer afternoon, a young boy was riding his bicycle along the quiet streets, weaving between shadows cast by tall oak trees. His sneakers pedaled rhythmically against the pedals as he hummed a tune to himself, lost in the simple joy of being outside. He wasn't thinking about much, just enjoying the breeze on his face and the sound of birds chirping somewhere nearby. To him, it was just another ordinary day. But sometimes ordinary days can take unexpected turns. As he rounded a corner, heading toward the park where kids often gathered to play basketball or chase each other around, something caught his attention. A police car rolled slowly down the street, its tires crunching softly against the asphalt. It wasn't unusual to see cops patrolling the area. They were always around, keeping an eye on things. But there was something different about how this one seemed to be moving. Slower than usual, deliberate, almost like it had a purpose. The boy glanced at the car but didn't think too much of it. He figured they were probably checking out some noise complaint or maybe looking for someone who'd wandered off. Whatever it was, it didn't concern him. So, he kept riding, steering his bike toward the shade of a big tree near the edge of the park. But then, the car stopped. It pulled up beside him so suddenly that he almost swerved off balance. Startled, he hit the brakes on his bike and looked up, squinting into the sunlight reflecting off the windshield. Two officers stepped out of the vehicle, their uniforms crisp under the bright afternoon sun. One of them, a taller man with sharp features and a stern expression, spoke first. "Hey you," the officer called out, pointing directly at the boy. "Stop right there." The boy froze, unsure what to do. His heart began to race. Why were they stopping him? What had he done wrong? He hadn't broken any rules. He was just riding his bike, minding his own business. Still he obeyed, setting his feet firmly on the ground and gripping the handlebars tightly. "Is everything okay?" the boy asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. He tried to sound calm, but inside, he felt a knot forming in his stomach. The second officer, shorter and stockier, walked closer, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. "We got a report," he said gruffly. "Someone matching your description stole from a store earlier today." The boy blinked, confused. Stealing? From a store? That couldn't be right. He hadn't even been near a store all day. All he'd done was grab a sandwich from home before heading out to ride his bike. I didn't steal anything," he stammered, shaking his head vigorously. "I swear I didn't." But the officers weren't listening. They exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. The taller one gestured for the boy to step away from his bike. "Come on, kid, let's go have a chat." Fear gripped the boy like a vice. Something about the way they looked at him made his skin crawl. Their eyes weren't curious or concerned. They were cold, calculating. Like they'd already decided he was guilty. Reluctantly, he followed them, leaving his bike behind. As they led him across the street to a small patch of grass near the park, dread settled deep in his chest. He didn't know what was coming next, but he could feel it in his bones. This wasn't going to end well. Little did he know this moment would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire town. Because while these two officers thought they were dealing with just another kid, they had no idea who this boy really was. Or, more importantly, who his father was. The boy stood awkwardly on the grass, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to steady himself. The two officers loomed over him, their towering figures casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. The taller one crossed his arms, his jaw tight while the shorter one smirked, almost like he was enjoying the situation. The boy could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. He didn't know what to say or do. Everything felt surreal, like he'd stepped into some kind of nightmare. "All right, kid," the taller officer said, breaking the silence. His voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness of the park. "Let's get this straight. You were seen near that store earlier today. Care to explain?" The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I wasn't there," he replied, his voice shaking. I swear, I don't even know which store you're talking about. I've been riding my bike all day. The shorter officer chuckled, a low, dismissive sound that made the boy's stomach churn. Oh, come on, he said, leaning closer. We've heard that excuse before. You think we're just going to believe you because you say so? The boy took a step back, instinctively trying to create some distance between himself and the men. But the taller officer moved quickly, blocking his path. Don't try anything funny, he warned, his tone icy. Just answer the question. For a moment, the boy didn't respond. His mind raced, searching for words that might convince them he was telling the truth. But no matter what he said, they didn't seem to care. It was like they'd already made up their minds about him. And that realization hit him hard. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was anger, frustration, and a deep sense of helplessness bubbling inside him. Then, without warning, the shorter officer reached down and grabbed the boy by the arm. You know what? He sneered. Maybe a little lesson is in order here. Teach you not to mess with people. The boy's eyes widened in panic. What are you doing? Let go of me, he protested, struggling to pull away. But the officer's grip was firm, unrelenting. Shut up, the taller officer snapped, stepping closer. You're going to listen and you're going to learn. Before the boy could react, the shorter officer bent down and yanked off one of his sneakers. The boy stumbled, thrown off balance as the officer held the shoe up in front of his face. Here's your first lesson, he growled. If you lie to us, there are consequences. The boy stared at him, horrified. What are you talking about? Please stop. But the officer ignored his pleas. Instead, he shoved the shoe toward the boy's mouth. Eat it, he commanded, his voice cold and mocking. The boy froze, unable to believe what he was hearing. No, he whispered, shaking his head. I can't. You will, the officer insisted, pressing the shoe harder against the boy's lips. Unless you want more trouble. Tears welled up in the boy's eyes as he realized he had no choice. These men weren't going to let him go, not until they got what they wanted. Slowly, reluctantly, he opened his mouth and bit down on the rubber sole. The taste was bitter, unnatural, and it made him gag. He chewed once, twice, his body trembling with humiliation and disgust. The taller officer watched silently, his expression unreadable, while the shorter one laughed, clearly amused by the whole thing. That's right, he taunted. Not so tough now, are you? The boy couldn't speak. He couldn't move. All he could do was sit there, tears streaming down his cheeks, as the officers continued to mock him. Every second felt like an eternity, stretching out endlessly until finally, mercifully, they stopped. There, the shorter officer said, tossing the shoe onto the ground. Now maybe you'll think twice before lying to us next time. The boy didn't respond. He couldn't. He just sat there staring at the ground, his mind blank except for one overwhelming thought. Why is this happening to me? As the officers walked away, leaving him alone on the grass, the boy finally allowed himself to break down. He curled into a ball, sobbing quietly, his chest heaving with each breath. He felt small, powerless, and utterly defeated. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be vulnerable, to have no control over what happened to you. Little did he know this moment would set off a chain reaction that would ripple far beyond the confines of that quiet park. Because somewhere out there, someone important was watching, and they weren't going to let this kind of injustice slide. This expanded version keeps the tone natural and relatable while maintaining emotional depth. It focuses on the boy's perspective, making the audience empathize with his fear and humiliation. Let me know if you'd like adjustments or further expansions. The boy stayed on the grass for what felt like forever, his body trembling and his mind racing. He didn't know how long he sat there, clutching his knees to his chest, but the sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. The world around him seemed distant. Muted sounds of birds chirping and kids playing somewhere far away barely registered in his ears. All he could focus on was the bitter taste still lingering in his mouth and the heavy weight of shame pressing down on him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he forced himself to stand up. His legs wobbled beneath him, weak from the emotional toll of everything that had just happened. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to dry the tears that refused to stop flowing. His shoe lay abandoned on the ground where the officer had tossed it, scuffed and dirty. Hesitantly, he picked it up and slipped it back onto his foot, tying the laces tightly as if doing so could somehow anchor him to reality. He didn't want to go home. Not yet. How could he face his mom after something like this? What would he even say? The thought of explaining what those officers had done made his stomach churn. But he knew he couldn't stay in the park forever. So, taking a deep breath, he climbed back onto his bike and began pedaling toward home, each turn of the wheels feeling heavier than the last. When he finally arrived, the house was quiet. His mom wasn't in the living room or kitchen, so he figured she must be upstairs. For a moment, he considered sneaking past her, hiding out in his room until he could figure out how to process everything. But then he heard her voice calling from the hallway. "Hey, sweetie, is that you?" she asked, stepping into view. Her face lit up when she saw him. At least, it did at first. But as she got closer, her smile faded, replaced by concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "Why are you crying?" The boy froze, caught off guard by her question. He hadn't realized his tears were still falling. Quickly, he tried to wipe them away, shaking his head. "Nothing," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. "I'm fine." But his mom wasn't convinced. She knelt down in front of him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Don't lie to me," she said softly. "Something's bothering you. Tell me what happened." For a moment, he hesitated. The words stuck in his throat, tangled up with fear and embarrassment. How could he tell her? How could he explain that two police officers, people who were supposed to protect him, had treated him like dirt, forcing him to do something so humiliating that he could barely look at himself? I got into trouble," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. His mom's eyes widened. "Trouble? What kind of trouble?" He shook his head, fresh tears spilling over. "It wasn't my fault. They said I stole something, but I didn't. I swear, Mom, I didn't." Now she looked even more worried. "Who said that? Who accused you?" "The cops," he blurted out, his voice cracking. "They stopped me at the park and they made me—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Made you what?" She pressed gently, her tone calm but firm. "Tell me everything." So, haltingly, he did. He told her about the accusations, the way they'd cornered him, and the cruel lesson they'd forced him to endure. By the time he finished, his mom was sitting on the floor beside him, her face pale, and her hands clenched into fists. "That's enough," she said suddenly, her voice low but full of determination. "This isn't okay. We're not letting this slide." She stood up abruptly, pulling out her phone. "We're calling your dad." The boy blinked, surprised. His dad? He hadn't seen his dad in years, not since his parents split up. They weren't exactly close anymore, and he rarely talked about him. But his mom seemed sure, dialing the number without hesitation. As the phone rang, the boy watched nervously, unsure what to expect. When someone answered on the other end, his mom wasted no time. "Elijah? It's me. Look, I need your help. Something happened to your son today, and it's bad. Really bad." The boy's heart skipped a beat. Elijah. That was his dad's name. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in so long that it sounded almost foreign. And now, here was his mom, reaching out to the man who had been absent for most of his life, asking for his help. On the other end of the line, Elijah listened intently as his ex-wife explained the situation. At first, his voice was calm, asking questions and gathering details. But as she described what the officers had done, his tone shifted, becoming sharper, angrier. "They did what?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Are you serious?" By the time the call ended, Elijah was already making plans. I'll be there tomorrow morning, he promised. This isn't going to stand. Hanging up the phone, the boy's mom turned, back to him, her expression softer now. Your dad's coming, she said simply. And trust me, he's not going to let this go unanswered. The boy nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what to feel. Relief? Fear? Hope? Maybe all three. One thing was certain. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be quiet. His dad was known for being a fighter, for standing up against injustice wherever he found it. If anyone could make sense of this mess, it was him. As night fell and the boy climbed into bed, he replayed the day's events in his mind over and over again. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. The officers who had humiliated him had no idea who they were dealing with. And soon, everyone else would find out too. The next morning came quicker than the boy expected. He hadn't slept much, his mind replaying the events of the previous day over and over again like a broken record. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the officers' smirking faces, heard their taunting voices, and felt the bitter taste of rubber in his mouth. Sleep was impossible, so he spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, wondering what would happen now. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, the house was already buzzing with activity. His mom had been up since dawn, pacing back and forth, making calls and jotting down notes on a notepad. She looked exhausted but determined, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity that made the boy both nervous and comforted. If anyone could handle this, it was her. Then there was the anticipation of his dad's arrival. The boy hadn't seen Elijah in years, not since his parents split when he was just a kid. Memories of him were hazy, a tall man with broad shoulders and a commanding voice who always seemed to be rushing off somewhere important. Back then, the boy hadn't understood why his dad wasn't around more often. All he knew was that he missed him. But as time passed, those feelings faded into indifference. Or maybe it was just easier to pretend he didn't care. Now, though, everything felt different. This wasn't about missed birthdays or empty promises. This was something bigger, something that demanded attention and action. And if his mom was right, Elijah wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide. By mid-morning, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the tension in the house. The boy peeked through the window, his heart pounding as he watched a sleek black sedan come to a stop. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who looked exactly how the boy remembered him, only older, with streaks of gray threading through his hair. Elijah wore a sharp suit, his tie perfectly knotted, and carried a leather briefcase in one hand. Even from a distance, he radiated authority. Before the boy could react, his mom opened the front door, stepping outside to greet him. From where he stood, the boy could hear snippets of their conversation. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice tight but grateful. "I know it's short notice." Elijah nodded, his expression serious. "You don't have to thank me. This is my son we're talking about." Hearing those words sent a shiver down the boy's spine. It wasn't something he heard often. Not from Elijah, anyway. For years, he'd convinced himself that his dad didn't think about him much. But standing here now, watching the way Elijah straightened his shoulders and marched toward the house, it was clear that wasn't true. Whatever else might have gone wrong between them, Elijah cared. Deeply. When Elijah walked through the door, the boy froze, unsure what to do. Should he hug him? Shake his hand? Say something? Before he could decide, Elijah crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled him into a firm embrace. The boy stiffened at first, caught off guard by the sudden warmth, but then he relaxed, letting himself sink into the hug. It felt strange yet comforting, like finding a missing puzzle piece after years of searching. "I'm sorry this happened to you," Elijah said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I promise you, we're going to fix it." The boy nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. For the first time since the incident, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things really could get better. Once everyone was seated in the living room, Elijah took charge. He listened intently as the boy recounted the story, again asking questions and taking notes. Every detail mattered. The description of the officers, the location, the exact words they used. Nothing escaped Elijah's attention. When the boy hesitated, struggling to recall certain parts, Elijah encouraged him gently. "Take your time," he said. "This is important." As the conversation unfolded, the boy began to realize just how formidable his dad truly was. Elijah wasn't just some distant figure from his childhood. He was a force to be reckoned with. A lawyer known for fighting against injustice, particularly cases involving systemic racism and police misconduct. The boy had heard whispers of his reputation before, but never fully understood what it meant until now. Watching Elijah work, seeing the fire in his eyes and the precision in his movements, left no doubt in the boy's mind. These officers had made a huge mistake picking on him. After gathering all the information he needed, Elijah turned his focus to the next steps. "First," he said, addressing the boy and his mom, "we need evidence. That means finding witnesses, reviewing security footage from the area, and getting a copy of any reports filed by the officers. Second, we'll file a formal complaint with the police department, and third," he paused, his jaw tightening, "we'll make sure this doesn't stay hidden. People need to know what happened." His mom nodded, her expression resolute. "Whatever you need, we'll do it." Elijah smiled faintly, appreciating her support. Then he turned to the boy. "Listen to me," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "What those men did to you was wrong, plain and simple. They abused their power and they humiliated you because they thought they could get away with it. But they underestimated you, and they definitely underestimated me." The boy swallowed hard, feeling a mix of emotions swell inside him: fear, anger, pride. It was all tangled together, making it hard to breathe. Still, he managed to nod. "Okay," he whispered. "What do I need to do?" "For now," Elijah replied, "just trust me. I've got this." And for the first time in days, the boy believed him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever battles they'd have to fight, he knew one thing for certain: his dad wasn't going to back down. Not this time. The days following Elijah's arrival felt like a whirlwind. The boy watched as his dad transformed their quiet home into a makeshift command center. Papers were spread across the dining table, laptops hummed with activity, and phone calls came in nonstop. Elijah moved with purpose, his every action deliberate and calculated. It was clear he wasn't just reacting to what had happened. He was strategizing, planning each step carefully to ensure nothing was left to chance. For the boy, it was both comforting and overwhelming. On one hand, seeing his dad take charge gave him a sense of security he hadn't felt since the incident. But on the other hand, the weight of everything that was happening started to sink in. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger than that. People were paying attention, and soon everyone would know what those officers had done. Elijah wasted no time getting to work. First, he reached out to local activists and community leaders who specialized in addressing police misconduct. These were people who had spent years fighting for justice, organizing protests, and holding authorities accountable. They listened intently as Elijah explained the situation, their faces growing darker with anger as they heard the details. One woman, a fiery advocate named Renee, spoke up immediately. "This is exactly the kind of abuse we've been trying to expose," she said, her voice sharp. "If you're ready to fight, we're with you." Next, Elijah contacted journalists. He knew how powerful media coverage could be, not just to bring attention to the case, but to put pressure on the police department to act. Within hours, reporters began reaching out, eager to hear the story. Some wanted interviews with the family. Others focused on gathering statements from witnesses or reviewing any available footage. Elijah handled all of it with precision, making sure every detail was presented clearly and accurately. Meanwhile, the boy's mom played her part too. She went door to door in the neighborhood, talking to neighbors who might have seen something the day it happened. She also reached out to parents at school, explaining the situation and asking if anyone had information that could help. To the boy's surprise, people responded quickly. A few mentioned seeing the police car near the park around the time of the incident. Others offered to testify if needed. Slowly but surely, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. As word spread, so did the outrage. Social media lit up with posts about the incident. Someone had recorded part of the confrontation on their phone, a shaky video showing the officers towering over the boy, and shared it online. Within hours, the clip went viral, sparking conversations across the country. Hashtags like "Justice for the boy" and "accountability" now trended on platforms, drawing attention not only from ordinary citizens but also from politicians and celebrities. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying the call for justice. Back at home, the boy tried to process everything happening around him. At first, he felt embarrassed knowing that strangers were watching videos and reading articles about him. What would they think? Would they judge him? But then Elijah sat him down and explained why this mattered. "It's not just about you," he said gently. "This is about standing up against injustice. If we stay silent, nothing changes. But if we speak out, we can make people listen." That conversation stuck with the boy. For the first time, he began to see himself not as a victim, but as part of something larger, a movement aimed at creating change. Still, it wasn't easy. Every time he saw the video pop up on his feed or heard someone mention his name in an interview, his stomach churned. The memories came rushing back, vivid and painful. He found himself replaying the moment when the officer forced the shoe into his mouth, reliving the humiliation and fear. It was exhausting. To help him cope, Elijah arranged for the boy to meet with a counselor, a kind woman named Ms. Thompson, who specialized in working with kids who'd experienced trauma. Their sessions became a safe space where the boy could talk openly about how he was feeling without worrying about judgment. Ms. Thompson taught him techniques to manage his anxiety, like deep breathing exercises and journaling. She encouraged him to write down his thoughts whenever things felt overwhelming. "You're stronger than you realize," she told him during one session, "and you're not alone. Your family, your community, they're all here to support you." Those words meant a lot to the boy. They reminded him that even though he'd been through something unimaginable, he wasn't carrying the burden by himself. His mom checked in with him daily, making sure he ate properly and got enough rest. Elijah included him in discussions about the case, explaining each step so he wouldn't feel left in the dark. And slowly, bit by bit, the boy began to rebuild his confidence. Outside their home, the momentum continued to grow. Protests erupted in the town square, drawing hundreds of people demanding accountability. Signs read messages like, "No more," "Abuse and protect our kids." Community members spoke passionately about the need for reform, sharing stories of similar encounters with law enforcement. Even some local officials joined the demonstrations, acknowledging the systemic issues that allowed such incidents to occur. The police department, however, remained defensive. In a hastily organized press conference, the chief tried to downplay the incident, calling it an isolated event caused by miscommunication. He assured the public that internal investigations were underway and promised transparency. But few believed him. The lack of immediate action only fueled the protesters' determination. Through it all, Elijah remained steadfast. He worked tirelessly, coordinating with lawyers, activists, and journalists to keep the pressure on. Late at night, after everyone else had gone to bed, he could still be found at the dining table, poring over documents and drafting legal filings. The boy often peeked in on him, marveling at his dedication. There was no doubt in his mind now. His dad was fighting for him with everything he had. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah looked up from his papers and noticed the boy standing in the doorway. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his tone softening. The boy shook his head. I wanted to say thanks," he murmured, shuffling his feet nervously. "For everything." Elijah smiled, setting aside his pen. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "This is what dads are supposed to do, protect their kids." The boy nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. For years he'd doubted whether his dad cared about him. Now there was no question. Whatever happened next, he knew he wasn't facing it alone. The courtroom was unlike anything the boy had ever seen before. Rows of wooden benches stretched out in neat lines, filled with people whispering to each other or flipping through thick folders. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a scent that made him feel uneasy, like he didn't belong there. At the front of the room sat a large desk where the judge would preside, flanked by two flags, the national emblem on one side and the state seal on the other. It all felt so formal, so intimidating. Elijah stood beside him, his presence steady and reassuring. He wore his usual sharp suit, but today it seemed even more polished, as if he'd gone the extra mile to make sure he looked unshakable. His tie was perfectly knotted, his shoes gleamed, and his briefcase rested at his feet, packed with evidence, notes, and documents. Before they entered the courtroom, Elijah had pulled the boy aside for a quick pep talk. "This is your day," he said firmly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You've done nothing wrong. All you have to do is tell the truth. That's it, just the truth." The boy nodded, though his stomach churned nervously. Telling the truth sounded simple enough, but the thought of facing those officers again, of seeing their faces across the room, made his palms sweat. What if they lied? What if no one believed him? These questions swirled in his mind, making it hard to focus. When the proceedings began, the atmosphere shifted. The judge entered. Everyone rose to their feet, and the room fell silent except for the sound of shuffling papers and murmured instructions between lawyers. The boy sat near the front, close enough to see everything but far enough away to feel somewhat removed. Elijah stayed by his side, occasionally leaning over to whisper encouragement or explain what was happening. The first few hours were tedious. Lawyers argued back and forth about technicalities, filing motions, and objecting to pieces of evidence. For the boy, it was hard to follow. He kept glancing toward the defendant's table, where the two officers sat stone-faced, their expressions unreadable. They didn't look remorseful or guilty. They looked bored, almost as if this whole thing was an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. Then finally, it was time for testimony. Witnesses were called one by one. Neighbors who had seen the incident, unfold passers-by who had recorded parts of it on their phones, even store employees who confirmed that no theft had occurred that day. Each account painted the same picture: two officers abusing their power against a child who hadn't done anything wrong. But the turning point came when the boy himself was called to the stand. As he walked up to take his seat, his legs felt like jelly. Every eye in the room was on him, and the weight of their stares pressed down on his shoulders. He glanced at Elijah, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, he settled into the chair, gripping the edges tightly to steady himself. The prosecutor, a tall woman with glasses perched on her nose, started gently, asking basic questions to ease him into it. "Can you tell us what happened that day?" she asked, her voice calm and kind. The boy hesitated, his throat dry. He swallowed hard and began recounting the story, sticking closely to the facts as Elijah had instructed. He described how the officers stopped him, accused him of stealing, and then forced him to eat his shoe. His voice wavered at times, especially when he got to the part about the humiliation and fear he felt. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away, determined to keep going. Across the room, the defense attorney watched intently, waiting for an opening. When it was his turn to question the boy, he pounced, trying to poke holes in the story. "Are you sure it happened exactly like that?" he asked skeptically. "Isn't it possible you misunderstood what the officers were doing?" The boy stiffened, caught off guard by the accusation. Was this man implying he was lying? Before he could respond, Elijah stood up, his voice cutting through the tension. "Objection, Your Honor," he said sharply. "This line of questioning is inappropriate and attempts to discredit a minor without basis." The judge agreed, sustaining the objection, and the defense attorney backed off, for now. But the damage was done. The boy felt shaken, his confidence wavering. He looked to Elijah again, who mouthed two words: "Stay strong." After what felt like hours, the cross-examination ended, and the boy was excused from the stand. As he returned to his seat, he noticed the slight nod of approval from The prosecutor and the supportive smiles from some of the spectators. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him why he was here, to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for others who might face similar situations. As the trial continued, more evidence came to light. Surveillance footage from nearby. Businesses showed the officers interacting with the boy, their aggressive body language undeniable. Expert witnesses testified about patterns of misconduct within law enforcement and the psychological impact of such abuse on children. Each piece added weight to the case, chipping away at the officers' defenses. By the end of the week, closing arguments were delivered. Elijah took center stage, his voice resonating through the courtroom as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone measured yet impassioned. "What we witnessed here isn't just an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem. These officers abused their authority, targeting a child because they thought they could get away with it. They humiliated him, degraded him, and violated his rights, all under the guise of enforcing the law. If we allow this behavior to go unpunished, we send a message that it's acceptable. Is that the world we want to live in?" His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The boy watched as members of the jury exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, others scribbling notes. For the first time since the ordeal began, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they would listen. Maybe justice was within reach. When the final day arrived, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The jury filed back in after hours of deliberation, their faces giving nothing away. The foreperson stood holding a slip of paper that contained the verdict. The boy held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything else. "We find the defendants guilty on all counts," the foreperson announced. A wave of relief washed over the boy, followed by an overwhelming sense of triumph. Beside him, Elijah exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. Across the room, the officers stared straight ahead, their masks of indifference slipping slightly. It wasn't over yet, not completely. Sentencing would come later, along with discussions about reforms within the police department. But for now, the boy let himself bask in the moment. Justice had been served, and he had played a crucial role in making it happen. As they left the courthouse, surrounded by cheering supporters and flashing cameras, the boy looked up at Elijah. "We did it," he said softly, his voice tinged with awe. Elijah smiled, ruffling his hair affectionately. "No, son. You did it. I'm just proud to be here to see it." The courtroom verdict echoed like a thunderclap, reverberating far beyond the walls of the courthouse. News of the guilty ruling spread quickly, igniting celebrations in the streets and sparking conversations across the nation. For many, it wasn't just about holding two officers accountable. It was a symbol of hope that justice could prevail, even against powerful systems designed to protect those in authority. For the boy, however, the victory felt bittersweet. On one hand, he was relieved that the truth had finally come out, and that the officers would face consequences for their actions. But on the other hand, the scars from that day still lingered, both the emotional wounds inside him and the memories etched into his mind. No verdict could erase what had happened or make him forget the humiliation and fear he'd endured. Still, there was a sense of closure, a small but significant step toward healing. Elijah understood this better than anyone. After the trial ended, he didn't pack up his briefcase and leave town as some might have expected. Instead, he stayed close, checking in regularly with the boy and his mom. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The trauma of such an experience doesn't disappear overnight no matter how strong someone is. So, Elijah made sure they had access to resources, a counselor, support groups, and educational materials to help them navigate the aftermath. One evening, after the dust had settled somewhat, Elijah sat down with the boy for a heart-to-heart talk. They were in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm light over the furniture. Outside, the world buzzed with activity, but inside it was quiet, almost peaceful. "You know," Elijah began, leaning forward slightly, "what you did took incredible courage. Not everyone would have been able to stand up and speak the truth, the way you did. The boy looked down at his hands, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. I didn't really feel brave, he admitted softly. Most of the time, I just felt scared. That's normal, Elijah replied gently. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid. And you did that. You stood your ground. And because of that, people are talking. This case has already started conversations about how we treat kids, especially black kids, when it comes to law enforcement. The boy nodded slowly, processing his dad's words. It was true. He'd seen the news, coverage, the protests, the hashtags trending online. People everywhere were using his story to demand change. At first it had made him uncomfortable, knowing so many strangers were watching videos and reading articles about him. But now he began to see it differently. His voice mattered. His experience mattered. Maybe, just maybe, sharing his story could prevent others from going through the same thing. Do you think anything will actually change? The boy asked hesitantly. I mean, will this stop happening to other kids? Elijah sighed, running a hand over his face. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said honestly. But every time someone speaks up, every time someone holds people accountable, it moves us closer to a better future. That's why we can't stop here. We've got to keep pushing, not just for ourselves, but for everyone else who deserves fairness and respect. Over the next few weeks, Elijah kept his promise. He worked tirelessly, collaborating with activists, lawyers, and community leaders to push for reforms within the police department. Together, they drafted proposals for stricter accountability measures, mandatory de-escalation training, and independent oversight committees to review misconduct cases. Some of these ideas faced resistance, particularly from officials reluctant to admit fault, but Elijah refused to back down. He used every tool at his disposal: media interviews, public speeches, petitions signed by thousands to keep the pressure on. Meanwhile, the boy began finding ways to heal. With Ms. Thompson's guidance, he started journaling, pouring his thoughts and feelings onto paper whenever he felt overwhelmed. Sometimes he wrote letters he never intended to send, letters to the officers, to himself, even to his younger self before everything happened. Writing became a form of release, a way to process the pain and reclaim a sense of control. He also reconnected with old hobbies he'd abandoned during the darker days. Riding his bike again brought a strange comfort, a reminder of simpler times, before the incident. Occasionally, Elijah joined him, pedaling alongside as they explored quiet streets and parks together. Those rides gave them space to bond without needing words, strengthening the relationship they'd rebuilt during the trial. As the months passed, the boy noticed something else. People were starting to listen. Local schools invited him and Elijah to speak at assemblies where students listened intently as they shared their story. Community centers hosted workshops focused on youth empowerment and civil rights, encouraging young people to use their voices to advocate for change. Even politicians referenced the case during debates, promising to prioritize policing reform if elected. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the attention felt suffocating, when the weight of expectation threatened to crush him. During those times, Elijah reminded him that he didn't have to carry the burden alone. Your job is to heal, he told the boy firmly. Everything else, the advocacy, the speaking engagements, that's a choice. Do it only if it feels right. And sometimes, it did feel right. Standing in front of a crowd, sharing his story, and seeing the impact it had on others filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. For the first time in a long time, he felt proud, not just of surviving, but of thriving despite everything. By the end of the year, tangible progress began to emerge. The police department implemented several of the proposed reforms, including body cameras for all officers and regular audits of misconduct reports. While critics argued the changes weren't enough, supporters celebrated them as a step in the right direction. More importantly, the conversation had shifted. People were no longer willing to accept abuse of power as inevitable. They demanded better, and they weren't backing down. One crisp autumn afternoon, as golden leaves danced in the wind, The boy stood beside Elijah at a community rally. Hundreds of people had gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans calling for justice and equality. When it was their turn to speak, Elijah stepped up to the microphone first, addressing the crowd with passion and conviction. "This fight isn't over," he declared, his voice ringing out loud and clear. "But today we celebrate a victory for truth, for accountability, and for the belief that every child deserves to grow up safe and free from fear." Then, turning to the boy, he gestured for him to join him at the mic. The boy hesitated for a moment, nerves fluttering in his chest. But then he remembered something Elijah had told him. "Your voice has power." Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, gripping the microphone tightly. "I'm not special," he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies swirling inside him. "I'm just a kid who wanted to ride his bike and live his life. What happened to me shouldn't have happened to anyone. But if telling my story helps even one person, then it was worth it." The crowd erupted into applause, cheering, and clapping as tears pricked the corners of his eyes. In that moment, surrounded by love and support, he realized something profound. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a survivor, a fighter, a beacon of hope for others walking similar paths. And standing there, hand in hand with his dad, he knew they'd done something extraordinary, not just for themselves, but for generations to come. As months turned into years, life began to settle into a new rhythm for the boy and his family. The trial, the protests, and the media frenzy slowly faded from the headlines, replaced by newer stories and fresher controversies. But the impact of what had happened stayed with him, not as a burden anymore, but as a driving force. It shaped who he was becoming, teaching him lessons about resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. Elijah remained a constant presence in his life, not just as a father, but as a mentor and guide. Their bond had deepened through the shared battle they'd fought together. What started as a fractured relationship transformed into something solid and unshakable. They spent weekends working on projects around the house, taking long bike rides, or simply sitting side by side watching sports on TV. Those quiet moments meant as much to the boy as the big speeches and rallies. They were reminders that no matter how loud the world got, there was always someone cheering for him quietly in the background. One day, while cleaning out the garage with Elijah, the boy stumbled upon an old box filled with newspaper clippings, photos, and notes from the case. He hadn't seen these things in years, and seeing them now brought back a flood of emotions. Some of the memories stung, but others made him smile. The way people had rallied around him, the strength he discovered within himself, and the changes that had come because of it all. "Why did you keep all this stuff?" the boy asked, holding up a faded photo of himself speaking at a rally. Elijah chuckled, wiping grease off his hands before answering. "Because it's important," he said simply. "This wasn't just your story, it was a turning point. Moment when people woke up and realized we can't stay silent anymore." The boy nodded thoughtfully, flipping through the clippings. Each headline told part of the journey. Guilty verdict sparks hope for reform. Community rallies behind courageous boy. Police department implements sweeping changes. Looking at them now, he realized how far they'd come since that awful day in the park, but the work wasn't done. Elijah often reminded him that justice wasn't a destination, it was an ongoing process. Together they continued advocating for change, though in smaller, quieter ways now. Instead of massive protests, they focused on grassroots efforts, hosting workshops at local schools to teach kids about their rights and how to interact safely with law enforcement. They also worked with community organizations to provide resources for families dealing with similar situations. For the boy, these activities became a source of purpose. He loved seeing the light in other kids' eyes when they learned they had a voice too. One afternoon, after leading a session at a middle school, a shy girl approached him nervously. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered, clutching her notebook tightly. "Of course," he replied, crouching down to meet her eye level. "What if nobody listens to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if I try to speak up and nothing changes?" Her question hit close to home, stirring memories of his own doubts and fears. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Then he remembered something Elijah had told him long ago. Change starts small. You might feel like you're shouting into the wind. Sometimes, he admitted gently, and yeah, not everyone will listen right away. But every time you speak up, you plant a seed. Maybe one day those seeds grow into something bigger, something that makes life better for everyone. The girl nodded slowly, her expression softening. Thanks, she murmured before walking away. Watching her go, the boy felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was why he kept going, to remind others that they weren't alone. As he grew older, the boy carried these experiences with him, letting them shape his future. In high school, he joined the debate team, using his skills to argue passionately for civil rights and social justice. His teachers noticed his determination and encouraged him to pursue a career in advocacy or law. At first, the idea seemed daunting. Lawyers were intimidating figures in suits, wielding words like weapons. But then he thought of Elijah, who used his knowledge not to intimidate but to protect and empower. Maybe, just maybe, he could do the same. By the time graduation rolled around, the boy stood on stage accepting awards for leadership and community service. As he scanned the crowd, he spotted Elijah sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. Beside him sat his mom, dabbing tears from her eyes. In that moment, he knew none of this would have been possible without their unwavering support. After the ceremony, Elijah pulled him aside for a private chat. So, he said, grinning mischievously, what's next for you? College? Law school? Saving the world? The boy laughed, shaking his head. I don't know yet, he admitted. But whatever I do, I want it to make a difference, like what we've been doing together. Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder, his gaze steady and full of pride. You already are making a difference, he said firmly. Don't ever forget that. Years later, as the boy, now a young man, walked into a courtroom for the first time as a practicing attorney, he carried the lessons of his past with him. Every case he took, every client he represented was a reminder of why he chose this path. He vowed never to lose sight of the humanity behind the law, to treat each person with dignity and respect, and to fight tirelessly for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Outside the courthouse, a group of students gathered, eager to hear him speak about his journey. As he addressed them, sharing his story of pain, perseverance, and purpose, he saw reflections of his younger self in their wide eyes. They were hungry for hope, for proof that even the hardest battles could be won. When I was your age, he began, his voice calm but powerful, I faced something that felt impossible to overcome, but I learned that our voices matter. That standing up for ourselves and others isn't just important, it's necessary. If my story teaches you anything, let it be this. Never stop believing in the power of truth. Never stop fighting for justice. And most importantly, never let anyone silence you. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the plaza like a promise. A promise that the cycle of courage and change would continue, passed from one generation to the next. And as he walked away, surrounded by supporters and admirers, the young man smiled, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be.